Welcome to the Trouble with Writing podcast, where we chat about the real issues that stop multilingual writers producing effective English and see where we can help. Hi, Pete.
Hey, Paul.
Hi, Phil. How you doing, guys?
Hey, doing good, thanks. Hi, Phil.
Yeah, all well here, thanks. I'm back in the UK this month, and then I'll be back to Spain. But yeah, all great with me. What about yourselves?
Everything's cool? Everything's cool. I've been doing a lot of reading lately. And actually, I want to share with our viewers, just the other day, I received copies of two of Philip's works. And I've begun reading this one, 15 Brief Moments in Time, which is already, I can tell you, it's fantastic. And I'm not saying that because Philip's a friend. I'm saying that because I'm a pretty avid reader and a pretty experienced reader. And this is amazing stuff. And really the kind of stuff I love to read. Prior to that, I was reading this. Pete, if you could pronounce the name, Mario Vargas Llosa.
Yeah, I used to read a lot.
It's a fantastic novel. Yeah, it's a fantastic novel. I believe it's one of his newer ones. I want to say 2013. I read it once when I first picked it up and then began rereading it in the summer because the first line of the first chapter is, "That was a fabulous summer," period. I love that opening line for its simplicity and its power.
Yeah, it's a good hook.
So I wanted to, it's a great hook. It's just so simple, but it's so evocative and engaging. So I began reading again this summer, that novel, but I can't find it. This is just the cover.
Yeah.
Pete, what have you been reading?
Yeah, so I haven't got anything to hold up that's like quite so attractive because it's just a Kindle. But I'm reading a novel by Agatha Christie. And wait, I'll just get it up here.
Best-selling novelist of all time, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This one's called Peril at End House. And I've almost finished it. And yes, it's actually, I had someone say that Agatha Christie is a good example of hypnotic writing. And I really agree with that because, you just, when you get in, it's very easy to get into her stuff. And then you just you can't put it down. It's a real page turner. So yeah, I think she was a genius.
What do you think of Agatha Christie film adaptations?
Yeah, I enjoy them.
Have you seen many of the film adaptations?
Yeah, I've not seen
I love them too.
The latest one. Have you seen that one? The latest one is it Murder on the Orient Express?
Death on the Nile or Murder on the Nile, isn't it?
That's the latest one. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And it is a remake. I haven't seen that one, but I saw the original. I think it was made in the 1980s. I saw that just a few months ago. I do like them.
Yeah. I would
How
say
about you, Phil?
I mean, then usually I get a bit annoyed about films being remade constantly. Like, don't have any new stories. But I actually don't mind. Agatha Christie is always TV adaptations and like new films. So I don't know. I think each generation gets a sort of new version of famous characters like Poirot. So yeah, that was cool. I saw John Malkovich play Poirot in a recent one, and it was a bit different, and it was interesting.
Her work is almost like Shakespearean standards that can be interpreted in.
That's an amazing segue, Paul, to this book that I'm reading, Hamnet, which is a historical fiction novel by Maggie O'Farrell, and it's about the time of Shakespeare and actually the family of Shakespeare. I'm only part way into it, but it's pretty exciting so far. And I also have this, which I bought recently, Amy Hempel. She's a famous, I don't know, is she famous? She's a short fiction author from the States, New York, I think, but really looking forward to that because it's not that easy to find collections of short fiction in bookshops. And as you know, that's my jam. So it's great. So when you can finally get hold of one, or, especially as I live in Spain, I can't always get less popular books in English.
I was actually having a conversation yesterday with my wife about the death of the bookstore and the rise of Amazon. And I have to confess, although I, since I was a child, have loved both libraries and bookstores, I was an early adopter of Amazon because I felt the bookstores were letting me down. I actually live very close to a neighborhood with 3 or 4 bookstores. And I would just go and hang out there almost nightly after dinner. And I just found that titles that I had become aware of were just never around, never available. But they were so readily available once online shopping appeared, and I just started buying all my books online. So not that I want to celebrate the crushing of the little guy, but I don't know. I don't know how to feel about it.
There is
I miss bookstores.
Well, I mean, I think independent bookstores are having a bit of a resurgence in the UK after Amazon did kill off a lot of them. But there's actually a website called Bookshop. I think it's bookshop.com and bookshop.co.uk. And that was set up to try and not compete on price, but offer part of the money that is earned and give that back to independent bookstores. So you can actually select a store that's near you. And when you buy online, a small part of the profit goes to the stores. So that's quite a cool idea.
That's very cool.
I'm not sure if it's in Canada. I know there's one in the States and the UK.
That's a great idea. For me, the bookshops were always about browsing. You go there, maybe you're looking for one title, but the visual browsing, it's like the old record shops, right? You would just discover by browsing the product that was there. And I always found myself encouraged to try, in the case of music, artists I'd never heard of, I had never heard of, or in the case of bookshops, authors I'd never heard of, or titles I'd never heard of, but they appear in front of me, intriguing cover, into the bag. And I think that's lost in online shopping. Online shopping is great for searching for a specific title, but I do miss the browsing.
Yeah. I think this is
where you get
possibly like what I mean. People are talking a lot about the metaverse. So this is possibly like what they want to start to bring back, like experiences, but online. So the moment, like you say, and probably it's never going to be the same. Right? So if it's online, however sophisticated the metaverse may be, it's never going to be the same as actually in real life. But that is probably what they're trying to simulate, so that we get back those experiences that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Without the tactile element. I don't know. I still love touching books or touching records, for that matter. Yeah.
All right. Hey, so what are we awesome, talking about today?
Well, guys, how about we talk about vocabulary today?
Yeah, pretty
think about vocabulary?
Important topic. Pretty important topic for all kinds of writers, right?
Mm-hmm. I think as long as we're just discussing, written words, written language, vocabulary has to be talked about, right?
For sure. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Particularly because I work a lot with academic writers, whether they're university students or post-high school students preparing for university, or even university professors who write in non-English native speakers. For them, vocabulary is an essential consideration. And I suppose I could characterize the importance of vocabulary in academic writing in conjunction with what I talked about in our last podcast about style. One of the features of academic writing that warrants attention to vocabulary is the need for specificity. And depending on what discipline you're writing about, whether it's medicine or sociology, it's going to have its own cluster of what we might call academic vocabulary. But what it really is just words specific to that discipline that may or may not be commonly used elsewhere. So I think what's often called academic vocabulary is really just vocabulary specific to a discipline. As you can imagine, something like medicine has a lot of words that we wouldn't use discussing sociology or the arts. And I think it's essential for someone writing in those disciplines to really narrow those, how can I say it, like narrow down the parameters of the discipline they're working in. How do you do that? Well, there are all kinds of lists you see floating around online. And they're useful to a degree, but they tend not to be discipline specific. There's something that's known as the academic word list that was developed, I think, University of Victoria in New Zealand. Is it New Zealand or Australia? Where's Victoria?
Australia, I think.
I think it's, yeah. And that's a sort of general overall academic word list that every college student needs in their arsenal. And it's pretty good, but what are you supposed to do with it? Are you supposed to, memorize all of these words and hope you need them someday? I don't think that's effective. For me, and you guys tell me what you think of this, but for me, the number one recommendation I make to all of my academic students is read. Read in the discipline you are studying. And if that's a problem, if I meet resistance from my student, like, oh, teacher, I don't like reading. Well, why are you studying that discipline is my next question. If you're not interested in that topic, get out of it. Or if they're studying that discipline for reasons that are not related to the field itself, like they think it's going to lead to a good job, then for me, I would just say, look, if that's all you care about is getting through that and getting a degree, then maybe all you need to do is memorize these words and sprinkle them like salt and pepper on your writing and hope for magic. So I don't know. Maybe I feel a little bit jaded about it, but I think really if you are interested in a certain discipline and that's what you chose to study, then the best way to see the vocabulary in use in context is to read. And then when you encounter words you don't know, get the old dictionary out, learn the word, learn the definitions, learn the varieties of definition, learn the part of speech, learn the grammar involved in the word, and then practice using it. So for me, working with academic writers, the key is to read within that discipline and identify words that are new and adopt them, assuming they're writing in that discipline. So there's a need for specificity, and that ends up being what we call academic words. But I don't necessarily think those words are like unique to a discipline and you just never use them elsewhere. Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
The question, I wondered, obviously, scientists should be reading. We often hear that advice. I just wondered, if you could go a bit deeper, what should these academic students be doing when they're reading? Are there any particular tasks or things they should be looking for?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Trying to find new words.
Yeah, I think the best reading is active reading. I've even done that when I've worked on my own writing or even my own creative writing, is identifying turns of phrase or figurative use that I really thought was fantastic, and extracting it from the reading I'm doing and making a little list and examining what about that phrase was interesting to me and trying to deconstruct it, not to imitate it or copy it, but to understand why it had that effect on me. Similarly, with academic writing, I would encourage my student to be active about it and to keep a journal going. Not a list of words to memorize necessarily, but actively identifying while they read words that are within that discipline because they're reading a text about that topic. But when they encounter words that are new to them, identifying them, and refer to the dictionary, but I want to be more active than that. I also recommend physically writing it, even more than typing it, because I do think, and my own experience as a student, this is what I did with transcribing a word in pen in a notebook or something with the definition and the word part of speech that physically engages you with that word. And I think that's better for memory. It's better for developing a connection and affinity with that word, which I hope leads to being able to use it because the recall is there. The physicalization of your relationship to that word is there. So I'm a big fan of note-taking and active reading. So having a notepad beside you when you're studying that book and going through the reading. Also highlighting, if it's a school book, highlighting passages or keywords. I've done that in my own study, but I also found that highlighting left the word sort of intellectual and less physical. So part of developing vocabulary is remembering the damn word in the first place. So I would encourage them to highlight it, yes, but pull it out, get it in your hand, and write it in a journal, write it in a notebook, and have a dictionary. I'm a big fan of dictionaries. Big fan of dictionaries, physical dictionaries. Have one on your desk. Look up the word. And by the way, I don't have my dictionary handy, but I always tell my students the same thing. When you look up a word on your phone, yes, it's convenient while you're on the bus or the tram or something. But when you look up a word in the online dictionary, you get the word in its definition. However, if you do the same thing in your hard copy dictionary, while you're looking up that word, you're also absorbing hundreds, maybe thousands of other words at the same time. You find that word by scanning down the page, and in the process of learning that word, you might also take a moment and learn the word beside it. So I just think there's more to be gained from a hard copy dictionary. It's not convenient to lug around the big Oxford, but I recommend having one on your desk. But yeah, in summary, Phil, I definitely espouse active reading and pulling out vocabulary and making it physical.
I think you made a great point, firstly, about lists. So it's much better to make your own list than to find a pre-made list on the internet.
Absolutely.
Basically because of context. If you make your own list, it's because you've picked out these words from things that you've read, things that are meaningful to you. And so that's going to be much more memorable. Those words are going to be much more memorable than just random words find in lists. There are good lists and bad lists, but the best list is going to be your own list. So that would be the first thing I would say, to come back on some great points you're making there. And the other thing about dictionaries, I would add that whenever you look up a word in a dictionary, you want to consider the different forms of that word. Right? So you look up the noun, but then also consider that there might be a verb to it too, or there might be an adjective.
Absolutely.
So you want to make the most of that word with its different forms. Also, because I think it's very important to separate vocabulary from grammar. So one thing is learning a new word. Another thing is, can you use it in a sentence? And when you write a sentence, there's a grammatical element to that, right? So are you able to understand how to use the noun form of this word, the verb form of this word? So that would be a couple of things I would say about that.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Good points,
Absolutely.
Pete. And I think that's a big difference between speaking and writing, at a professional level in English. It's going that one level deeper and saying, right, well, I know what the word is, but if you can, all of its forms, then you have the variety to produce, better sentences and use it in certain constructions that will help you to use, the best, more powerful vocabulary. And I also really liked your point, Paul, about physically writing. I remember where this stat comes from. I think I saw it on the British Council. There was an article about vocabulary, and they said that it takes something like 17 instances or encounters with words until you can activate that vocabulary. So if we imagine that seeing a word for the very first time is one encounter, looking it up in the dictionary is another, writing it physically is another, looking back at it the next day and checking it is another. So we need this constant frequency of encountering words that helps us to actually activate them, not just remember these new words.
You really want to make it part of yourself, part of your thinking, part of your. Well, I guess the term is vernacular, but I think we're talking about something a little more personal, a little deeper, right? Making these words part of your life, part of your identity in a way.
I also think both of you there, you've both touched on developing sequences for learning words. So, I mean, Paul, you're talking about you're reading first, then you're highlighting, right? And then you want to take out those words. Right? You first might, if you don't understand them from context, you might go to a dictionary, and then you want to record them, right? And when you record them, you also then want to use them, right? So we're talking about activating. I mean, first step, as we said, is reading, right? You have to read to get exposure to this vocabulary. And the more times you come across the word, then the more likely you're going to at least understand it. But the question is, will it be enough to activate it? You actually use it in your own writing? Probably not, unless you actually go through those other steps. And once you record the word, that's when you want to also think of using it. And I would say definitely try to come up with your own example. That's something I always tell my students. And if the example is firstly in the context, the context you want to use it in your writing, that's important. Another way is to make it very personal to you. So the more something is in a meaningful context, or it's personal to you, the more you're likely to remember it. So yeah, sequences, I think, to learning words is really important.
Really interesting. I feel like this is something that wasn't taught in my education. I don't know about you guys. Even just the way to encounter words and acquire them and use them wasn't something that's really when I'm learning a foreign language or in my first language. So yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Definitely, yeah. I think it's because in traditional education, you go back to school, there's a lot of spoon feeding going on, right? And learners are not, students are not taught enough to become independent learners. There's not enough learner training, and learner training is so powerful because how much can you can have English lessons every day, right? But how long are you going to be dependent on your teacher? Right? How much time, how much money are you going to invest in lessons? Are you going to do it the whole of your life, or are you going to have fewer lessons, maybe less time in those lessons, but you learn really valuable life tools that you can always use? And I think that should be the ultimate aim of education, should be to empower people to be lifelong independent learners.
I think that's a great point, Pete. And you mentioned the idea of time. I think the three of us, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the three of us share a passion for reading. We just held up books that we've been reading, which probably started when we were children. Am I wrong? Were you guys active readers as children? I
Definitely.
imagine so.
I would say it took a little bit of us maybe after university because it gets a bit much.
Sure.
But big reader, yeah.
And I think what happens for us is that maybe we take for granted the sheer scale of the exposure we've had in our lives to English vocabulary through the reading experience we've had. We've had a long time to absorb words through reading, through listening. You know, the 17 instances you're talking about, we get those very quickly because we have so much exposure in our native countries. We may read a word, look it up in the dictionary, and then start noticing it in the subsequent days. You know how that thing works where I had this experience with my sister who works in law, and she's brilliant. Sometimes I'll pop a word on her and she'll go, "Oh, I've never heard that word." And then after that day, she'll hear it 1,000 times because she's now primed to notice it. And I think what happens in our experiences as native speakers is we get so much exposure. Those 17 instances occur intrinsically, and we have the benefit of time. But what happens for our non-native English speaking clients and customers and students is they don't have time. They haven't had the breadth of exposure that we have to vocabulary through reading and listening, and for that matter, seeing the word in our cultures. So we have to find systems and techniques to expedite their exposure actively. And so I often hear from my students, you know, how can I learn vocabulary quickly? And I'll caution them and say, look, okay, I know that time is against you because you're trying to get through university or get prepared for it or get a promotion in your work, and you want this vocabulary at your disposal expediently. However, if you want to do it quickly, you're going to have to get very active. You're going to have to be very conscious of studying it. You're going to have to get your 17 instances on your own by sheer force of will and self-discipline. And sometimes they don't want to hear that. You know, I'm always cautious of students seeking the magic formula. Wave the Harry Potter stick and you have a magnificent vocabulary. I can't offer that. So whereas we've had the benefit of the long-term exposure and accumulation of our vocabulary experience and using it and getting feedback from our parents and our teachers and our culture. You know, we get feedback, for example, if we're using a vocabulary word, if we're using a word inaccurately, and then suddenly we walk down the street and see it used accurately in an advertisement, well, we adjust our behavior, and no one told us to do that. So we're getting feedback within our culture. But our students, they don't have that time or that exposure. So we have to expedite that with them, and they have to do the work. That's my experience. Would you guys feel the same way?
Absolutely.
Or
yeah, and that's really the challenge to make learners understand the value of doing it, because it happens so often that you can explain these systems to learners, but to get them to actually do it, they have to understand the value of it. So, for example, I always tell my journalist students, you know, if you want to really engage your readers, if you want to establish yourself as an authority on the topic you write about, you have to go through these sequences, you have to implement these systems. And so as long as they understand the value, that's when they'll do it. And I was going to actually ask you both. So, I mean, just what type of vocabulary building strategies do you learn when it comes to the recording and the using stage? So I'm pretty sure Phil also uses spreadsheets like I do. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, Phil.
Please, I'm curious. I don't use them, so I'm curious.
Just wanted to touch on what Paul said about you know, getting students to read, and they often want to do it all at once and acquire all these words. I think a good word to use is sustainable. Building habit that's sustainable using a system, like Pete
Absolutely.
said, that's sustainable. Something, if somebody says, "Oh, well, I hate reading novels," well, they're not going to. What's the point in giving them 10 novels that they must read and note down all the interest words? That's not going to work for them. So I think it's about writers understanding what will work for them and appreciating that building a system which they can continue and which is reading that's relevant and interesting for them. That's the type of reading to go for.
Exactly.
And
absolutely.
Spreadsheets. I often work with writers who are going to need similar types of words again and again. And that's great if they have a certain vocabulary, but they're going to recycle and write articles and blogs which are quite similar. So good idea to build it, and Spreadsheet can help them do that. The reason it works well is it becomes a resource. It sounds pretty boring saying spend 10 minutes a day, adding words that you find to your spreadsheet and filling out all of these boxes. But again, like Pete said, if you can teach people that the value is, imagine in a year's time, you've got a spreadsheet with 10 different tabs, and the tabs are all of your specialist topics that you might be writing about. If you need to write a blog about cryptocurrency or something like that, you can go to your technology tab or your cryptocurrency tab and just have a quick browse of all of these terms that might fit in, and it will make your first draft so much richer, and it will really help you when you're looking for specific terms. So, I think people might use spreadsheets or list building their own lists in different ways. But the best thing is that it can become a resource for writers to utilize and to make their work more powerful.
Is that something I do too? Yeah.
I've never done that, but I'm going to do it now. It sounds great.
There's a couple of things that I suggest writers add to their spreadsheet, as well as the definition or what the word is in their first language. Things like word forms. That is an immediate way you can write. If you've got the word justify, then when you write that in, you can think, is there another form of that? Justification? Yes, that's a noun form. Type that in, and we have another encounter. Other things I'd suggest, synonyms, just getting used to having a quick look on thesaurus.com or in a physical thesaurus if you want one of those on your desk as well. And another box on the spreadsheet would be an example of the word in use. So writing your own example, maybe finding an example as well that you can add. Any other things you suggest, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great things that I always get students to do. Actually, the synonyms one I like. I like this idea of using a thesaurus. The context is absolutely essential. So the first thing going from this reading stage, right, to the highlighting and the recording, they should always take the context from what they've read. So then it all ties together. So you're reading something that, like you said, Phil, you're interested in, it motivates you. For my journalists, it's something they want to write about. This is when they're doing their search on a topic, right? And then they highlight useful vocabulary. So things like idioms are going to really help to engage their readers, or phrasal verbs. I often tell students to add a little bit of figurative language in their writing is a great way of engaging, of giving it more impact, clarity, because quite often this more figurative language, it can take abstract ideas and make it more concrete, right? So yeah, this type of language, when they then record it on the spreadsheet, it's very important to use the context. So actually, literally cut and paste from the article you noticed the vocabulary item, cut and paste that sentence onto the spreadsheet. That will be the first thing. And then what you said, Phil, give your own example. And that can be quite challenging for learners. So what I always tell them is the more examples you've seen first, the more you're going to really hammer home that meaning, you're going to really get the meaning. That's where, using a dictionary is really good, because, good online dictionaries, they always show you a few examples of how to do the word. So once you've seen a few examples, you're going to be more able to write your own example on the spreadsheet, which, as I said before, should be something that is really personal to you, or is very firmly in the context of what you want to write about. And yeah, the thing about the word forms, I would definitely always add those. So you have, for example, the column at the end with the target word. So if it's a noun, then also write the verb if it's a verb. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's crucial. And you get more mileage, so to speak, out of that. You look up one word and you get 3 or 4 in some cases, or at least 2. Now you have your vocabulary is expanding. I have a question for you guys. How can I put it? What role do you see, if any, with your non-native English speaking clients and students for translation? For example, translation devices are on their computer. What are the pros and cons involved with that? Or do you recommend it? Do you not recommend it? What's your take on that?
That's a great question.
Pete, what do you think?
So if it's learning vocabulary, I would say that the translation can complement, but it should never be the main thing. So I think that the context, as I said from the article, where they found the word. Also, I would also add the definition in English. Right? I think those are more important. Going through the process of looking at different examples, because you get the meaning from the more examples you see of the use of the word, the more you get the meaning. And I think all that is more valuable. But then if you want to really reinforce it just with a translation to your own language, if that helps you, then yeah, I tell students, that's fine to do. But it shouldn't be the main thing. It should only be to complement the other steps, I would say.
What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe translation's slightly different. It can help you in terms of time and reinforce, like Pete said. I think overall AI is really helpful and it's great. I think there's a bit of a misconception that it's replacing something. It's replacing our need to know something or our need to understand it. And the learning that students or other people can get is sometimes secondary. So if you use AI, for example, I work with a lot of content writers and they use AI to identify if their language is simple and effective. And these apps might, things like Hemingway app, might highlight a word and say, there's a simpler version of this. This word is too complex. That's very useful. It's also dangerous if you take all of those suggestions without actually understanding the why behind it. So if learners can use AI translation and other software to question its suggestions as well as accepting them, then I think it's really useful. And it's something that it can be a bit urgent, I think, with a lot of teachers saying, don't use Google Translate, it's evil and it will get everything wrong. It is improving all the time, I think the important thing to know that it's a complement rather than a replacement for improving your vocabulary, improving your written work.
Yeah, I agree. For example, I find that word reference is really useful, and actually also the bilingual part of word reference. So what you do, this is particularly useful for phrasal verbs. So like phrasal verbs are really useful for journalists, because phrasal verbs are quite often or less formal, right? And journalists like often have a more informal conversational style. Also, phrasal verbs can be figurative, which goes back to what we were saying before. When something's figurative, it sometimes can make a more abstract idea more concrete, compares the meaning to something that's more concrete. So, for example, I noticed one just in my reading earlier, pay off. So when this is used a lot in work or in sport, when someone has to work hard, do something, it pays off. Right? A lot of figurative language is related to money, right? Because money is something that everybody relates to, right? Because everyone has to earn a living. Right? But my point is with word reference is if you go to the bilingual, so you look at the translation, it also gives you a lot of other really useful information. So it'll tell you if a phrasal verb is separable or inseparable, right? If it's transitive or intransitive. So I mean is, does it have an object or not? And this is information that's really useful for learners if we go back to what we were saying before, that they have to also use the vocabulary in their writing in a sentence. So also, this more grammatical information is going to be really useful. And you can also get that from websites like Word Reference that give translations too. So I would say, combine whatever is going to help.
One of the pitfalls I've noticed along those lines, Pete, is that depending on how divergent the student's language is, if their native language is Spanish or Portuguese, for example, it's not quite as divergent from English as Chinese or Japanese or Korean is. One of the challenges I've seen with my Asian students relying too heavily on the AI and too heavily on direct translation is that they might get the meaning translated well, they might not, but they often don't get the grammatical use translated well enough for them to apply it in a sentence. But one of the things I've found that they haven't been able to replicate well is cultural interpretations and connotations within a culture. So, for example, we did this experiment once in a class with an all Japanese class. And in North America, certainly, and perhaps in Europe, the word chutzpah, is a very positive meaning. It means boldness and confidence. And, Steve Jobs started Apple. He showed a lot of chutzpah. Now, it's used in English, but I think it's originally a Yiddish word. In North America, it's used often to say, hey, someone's, really bold and innovative and courageous. Well, when the Japanese student saw that word in a piece of reading and they translated it using their computer, it translated it in meaning, but it also translated it culturally. And within the Japanese culture, such behavior is frowned upon to some degree. Being the one who steps out of the crowd, being the one who does what no one else is willing to do. As a cultural trait, it's discouraged to a degree. So for them, it had when they translated the word, they learned a very negative connotation. And I thought that's very interesting because even if you translate the meaning accurately, it may be reinterpreted or just take on a different connotation within a culture. I'm sure it occurs with Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese learners too, but it definitely is a danger or a hazard of translation for the Asian students. because not only is the language different, the culture is different too, the norms. Have you ever experienced anything like that?
It's such an interesting point, because if you imagine the world of English and how it's expanding and how so many people, different people are interacting and using it, if you imagine that without anyone at the helm, without any kind of anchor to the language, without Americans there to say, in our cultural understanding, chutzpah, which is a word from a different language used in this way, without that, it's going to diverge and can become quite difficult for people to understand each other. So yeah, it's really interesting that you brought that up, because something I really love about my job is being able to be that anchor point who can bring different cultural understandings together. And yeah, it might sound silly that we're talking about this over one word, but it's such a great example of how important it is that there are still these kinds of discussions. That's my 2 cents.
You both are British nationals, I believe. Let's say you're British English native speakers, and I'm a Canadian English native speaker. And for learners, I have noticed that they really want to know they really want to cling to a standard, right? Like mathematics, 1 + 1 will always equal 2. And they want to learn a standard English, but they also want to learn the divergent Englishes, the slangs, the more poetic language they hear in rap music from the US, for example. And, there's a lot of discussion about who owns English. And now that it's out there in the world and being used by so many different people as either a first or second or third or fourth language, how it's evolving. And I agree with that to an extent. It should evolve. And whoever uses it claims ownership of it to a degree. But I also think Phil's got a great point. There has to be some kind of common ground, whether it's grammatical or vocabulary. Without some kind of standard, we're entering into chaos. Like, I've said this before in one of my live shows, like, if we don't all agree that this is a pen, then meaning is lost. And if we don't all agree that English works subject, verb, object, or complement, we're not going to understand each other. But I guess the question is, and maybe this is for another podcast, but how standard should our standards be? When students ask me, teacher, what's the standard English that I should follow? Personally, despite being a Canadian, I always defer to the Oxford. I always recommend use the Oxford Dictionary or the Oxford Learner's Dictionary, because for me, British English is the source. It's the wellspring of the language. Canadian English is a deviation from it. American English is a deviation from that source. And I'm not saying all my students have to follow Oxford or Cambridge English. What I'm saying is, if you're confused about something, go to the source. And I think there should still be a source. Am I wrong in that? Or how do you guys feel about that coming from where you do?
So, for example, at the moment, a lot of my students are actually teaching a group of students who are writing for a North American audience, actually the USA. So that's their audience, right? So therefore, my, what I do is I, encourage them to, read articles written by, journalists who write for a US audience, right? And so what's important there is, for me, is how that community uses language, right? So, we know that there are differences between British English and American English, right? And some British people, might say, you can't say that. That's not right. I don't know. For example, I think one example is, I think in British English, at least traditionally, we didn't use the word impact as a verb. So we wouldn't say like impact something. We would say have an impact on something. At least traditionally that was the case. So then the question is, so is then it wrong to use it that way? I would say no, right? Because it depends. The language evolves. It depends on the people who use it, and it becomes standardized in American English in that way to use impact as a verb as well as a noun. Then who am I to say that that's wrong? And I would encourage my students, if they're writing for a US audience, I would say, yeah, you have to use the language the way that they use it. I don't know if that answers your question, Paul.
Well, it does, and it also points to the real ultimate goal is communication, communicative effectiveness, not passing the test or holding to the standard and meeting someone's approval. The goal of your language use is for the other person in that community to understand what you're saying. I think that's sort of the higher good, if you will.
Yeah,
I think it's.
What do you think, Phil?
I think it's great what we've talked about so far of developing a richer vocabulary, but I wanted to focus on that word powerful as well, which is, a really interesting way to think about what words we use. As I said, I've worked with a lot of writers who are writing web content and articles, which will probably be consumed by non-native speak English people in different territories or countries. And there's actually an interesting dictionary. There's a few different versions of it, but there's movements towards plain English, and there's a dictionary called the I'd have to look it up. I think it was the New General Service List, which is a group of, I think it's just under 3,000 words, something like 2,800 words. And that encompasses over 90% of all use of words. So if you know these 2,800 words, then you're getting sort of 90% coverage of the English language. And so what can make vocabulary powerful is if everybody's understanding every word that they read. And so for writing, I think one important thing is, for writers to consider their audience, as Pete said, and sometimes to choose these simpler words, which are more likely to be 1, 2, 3 syllable words. There's going to be fewer 4 syllable words, fewer Latinate words in there. So that was something I thought was interesting to bring up and kind of aligns with the question that you were asking. Again, I'm not sure if it's a direct answer.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it also raises a really important takeaway that the simpler word is best because it's direct and it connects directly with the reader or the listener in that community, that audience, and facilitates powerful communication. I think when we talk about powerful vocabulary, we're talking about the word that's most effectively communicating the idea, has the power to communicate clearly. And again, if that's our higher good in terms of communication, then simpler is better. I often tell students I have a sort of rule of thumb, which is 1 word is better than 2, 2 is better than 3, and so on. So if you have a sentence construction that's a little wordy and you can find an alternative word that can reduce the number of words in that sentence, that's better. It's better for the reader or the listener in any communication because it gets their idea to them more directly and more expediently.
What would your tips be, Paul, for students or writers who have found that perfect word, that simple word, but feel like they're using it too much? So they're writing an essay or, a journalistic article, and they need to avoid repetition. Do you have any tips or help on that? What would you?
Yeah, it's actually
advise?
Something I've been speaking about a lot lately because I'm I've been building an online writing course, a foundational course. And one of the topics is precisely that. One of the topics is cohesion and how to maintain cohesion, especially through a longer form piece of writing. And students are often taught, the students I've worked with often report to me that they've been taught to seek variety and avoid repetition. And I don't disagree with that. I think in English, repetition is discouraged because we want to use it to have impact. We want to use repetition sparingly so that when we do use it, it has the power that we seek from repetition, which is emphasis or reinforcing an idea. But if you repeat all the time, that one instance of repetition is going to lose its power to move. So we discourage the repetition. On the other hand, sometimes they get carried away. And what they'll do is they'll lose cohesion because whatever the key topic or the key idea of a paragraph is, I want them to use that word repetitively because it's holding the idea inside that word and it's maintaining the cohesion throughout. So this is what we call keywords. And I emphasize the use of keywords. And every paragraph may have one or maybe two only. So I would seek variety everywhere except the keyword. So if you have a long winding paragraph that goes into all kinds of tangents held together by what? Well, they can be held together conceptually by the keyword, but also typographically. Just seeing that same word maintains a reader's focus on an idea. So especially with these longer paragraphs in an academic writing, they can go all over the place and connect source material and so on. It's really important to bring all that together somehow, and repeating a key word, even up to 5 times in a paragraph, is an effective way of keeping it cohesive. Because I also believe that students are often saying to me that synonyms are two words with the same meaning, and I dispute that. I think every synonym is slightly different. It conveys a slightly different reality. Because, and correct me if, disagree with me if you want, I think that over time, if two words meant exactly the same thing, one of them would have evolved out of use, and we'd be left with one that's better. That being the case, when I work with students on this issue, I will try to encourage them, if their key word of the paragraph is, I don't know, population, don't look for a synonym for the word population. That word population is specific and it's going to hold the idea together. So let's repeat population, but let's seek synonyms elsewhere, in the verbs, in the other words that are not the crucial word of the topic. So I don't know, that's a long-winded way of answering or addressing the issue, but I think variety is essential because as readers, we crave novelty. We crave every sentence introducing a new idea that's exciting and enriches our understanding. And every word does likewise. But I also want to encourage them to repeat specific keywords that hold the topic together conceptually. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the synonyms not being the same word front.
They can be real close, but I think there's a little difference.
One thing that I often suggest, going back to this spreadsheet that we talked about and how we are learning and implementing words, is using a different form of the word. Mm-hmm. Like you said, Paul, if there's a key word that you need to keep hammering home, you can use different forms of that word.
Exactly.
I got a couple of examples here. Rather than saying a mass of people, you could say a massive crowd. So we've changed, a noun to an adjective there. Or what's another one? Rather than the effect of the market on inflation, you could have the market affects. The market affects with the verb. So
that has a resonating effect.
Yeah, I mean, it can just help you to tweak words so that they're not literally the same word form being used again and again. That's something that I suggest rather than, going for wacky synonyms, which you found in a thesaurus and you've never seen before, because they're likely to be wrong or call attention.
I think if they use synonyms in place of keywords, what happens is the reader's attention starts straying from the topic and can be misdirected depending on how divergent the synonym is. Can suddenly start taking the reader into a different direction. Like, hey, I thought we were talking about massive crowds or a mass of people. Now we're talking about religious mass or something else. That's the synonyms have a way of taking you into new areas that may or may not be where you want to be. Sorry, I think I cut you off there, Pete.
No, not at all. But it's just to reinforce really what you both said, that a common mistake is to think that the only way to avoid repetition, the only way to add variety is to find a synonym, and that's wrong, right? So the other way, which Phil has just talked about, is the other way of paraphrasing, right? So saying the same thing in a different way, is to use word forms. In fact, I'd also add like a third way, which is moving a little bit away from vocabulary, but it's sentence structure. Right? So you vary the sentence structure, you vary the word forms, and you use synonyms where appropriate. There are three ways that you can avoid repetition, add variety, keep your writing interesting.
Absolutely.
100%. So we have, maybe we could offer one tip. What's your takeaway point about how writers can develop a powerful vocabulary?
Well, I'll put in my 2 cents. I think for me, it really begins and ends with reading, but active reading. So I would encourage anyone who wants to develop a powerful vocabulary to read within their discipline or genre, and do so for pleasure, but maybe a second pass that's more active and extracting the vocabulary. And I had never used this technique before, but I love your technique of spreadsheets. I'm definitely going to adopt that if you don't mind. So read actively and build spreadsheets.
Oh, just again,
you, Pete?
So I think my main takeaway, we've talked about so many things, so I'm just going to focus on one, which would be building vocabulary strategies. So these sequences we're talking about. So start with reading, notice, highlight, vocabulary that's going to engage your readers, going to establish yourself as an authority, and then record it. Spreadsheet, I think, is a great idea that we've talked about quite a lot today. You'd also use mind maps. So I think a mind map can be a great way to record topic vocabulary. Right? So you have an article, journalistic article on a particular topic. You can use a mind map, have like the main keyword in the middle of your mind map, and then you branch off into related, useful topic vocabulary collocations, right? And then what you can do, which takes me on the next part, is recording and organizing, is using, right? With a mind map, you can actually use it, vocabulary that you recorded there, to summarize the article. So then you're writing a summary of the article using that key vocabulary. And that's so important to use it in order to activate it. And the other way to use the vocabulary is to, you can set yourself little tasks like, okay, so in my next article that I write, I'm going to use 5 words on the topic that I've recorded on my spreadsheet. So to summarize, it's really important to establish these systems, as we say. Go through the steps, repetition, right? Notice, highlight, record, organize, use.
Great.
Great. I definitely second that point of, those are both probably the main ways or the great way to acquire new words so that you can develop a vocabulary, better vocabulary. I think I would make the point about context and perhaps audience as well. Sometimes the most powerful words are simple, are short, and everybody knows them. If that is your objective when you're writing a piece of web content or a simple message, sometimes the type of words that you'll need to use will be more expert, right? You'll need more collocations and more technical terms, which will be 2 or 3 word terms. They will be longer. So I think that the point I would make is on context. Make sure that the words that you are using fit the context of your writing and are going to be the most powerful for your audience.
I think that's a great point, Phil, because the audiences will vary depending on the discipline or the genre of the writing. And ultimately, they're the ones that need to understand what you're saying. So when we talk about power in vocabulary, it's the power of the reader to understand your idea that we're after. So I think you make a good point about remembering the reader, keeping the reader in mind, right? Excellent.
Sure. Well, on that note,
lots of great ideas. Yeah.
On that note, maybe I'll wish you a good reading month. Hope you finish your books, whatever you're reading, and pick up some interesting new terms.
I'm going to have to read this too, Phil.
Where is he?
You published this quite
really
recently, right? It's 1:15.
Yeah, it's available in the UK and it's not available digitally. So it's a expensive game to post it around the world, but I would love you to read it, Pete, of course, and recommend everyone does the same. And people can check out my website if they want to find out what else I've written.
We can put the link to purchase it in the notes, Philip. I think
that
we can
would
do
be
that.
Great. Very kind.
Yeah.
Stay cool in the UK, Phil. It looks like
it's doing my best. It's pretty warm here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, guys. See you next time then.